Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks, colleagues, for joining in, and appreciation for initiating these brown bag discussions. I think they do generate a lot of learning opportunities as well as uh, opportunity to ask questions. So the discussion, as Nick, you've put it, the priorities for the African region, and more importantly, um, a dimension of what we can really be able to do, building on what we're already doing. And I'll start off with uh, an examples of reality because if we close our eyes to facts, we'll learn through accidents. And the experiences in life that sometimes are unforgettable are already being experienced by millions across the continent. This experience of Mama Yabo of Lagos, who a month ago witnessed with horror a man washed away by floods. And then in East Africa, a 70-year-old pastoralist in Somalia saw his family livestock being actually wasted away to death by ravaging floods. And as we're speaking today, the droughts have actually caused a loss in assets of livestock worth 600 million US dollars. But when you put this within the realities of what we know, the extreme events have become commonplace, and the IPCC assessment report did unequivocally point to the fact that the world with the current emissions today are stumbling towards bridging the safe 1.5 degree. And the UNEP emissions gap report corroborated with this, showing that the cumulative effect of all the countries' commitment to reduce emissions could only manage a 7.5 reduction against a safe threshold of 55%, which we're supposed to put in place to keep away from dangerous emissions. And if we were to put all the commitments together, we will be on a dangerous path to reaching 2.7 degrees. So what is in this for Africa? Well, we know that Africa is warming fast as twice as the rest of the world. And the implication is a much faster deterioration. And this deterioration, for example, the continent is enduring already 3 to 10% of hyper-arid and arid increased frequency of extreme events, 20% decline in precipitation, and 50% drop in rain-fed agriculture. But when you look at these realities that are already there, one of the key aspects is how is Africa faring when it comes to the economies. They are losing up to 20 billion each and every year on the lower side, and up to 15% in per capita growth income. So when you dovetail these within the context of the continent, so it's fair to say in simple terms that the productive output of each African is reduced by 5 to 15% every year because of climate change. And this is reflected in food systems, damage in infrastructure, increased prevalence of disease, lost biodiversity, which affects key important sectors like tourism, among others. Yes, that we know. Then what then is Africa's emission profile within the global context? So we know Africa is a continent, 17% of global population, yes, accounting for less than 3 to 4% of global carbon emission. That is out there. And so this makes the continent, yes, at least emitter, but at the same time, a net positive continent whose net positivity contributes significantly to stabilizing the global climate. But on top of that, it's not just that Africa rainforests, they are famed to be among the best carbon sponges in the entire world. And the Congo Basin, for example, offsets carbon in the entire globe, which is an asset for the continent. But on top of that, the continent's emissions, the average emission per person in the entire continent is 0.8 tons of carbon per person. But this figure, I just want to put it in perspective so that we can actually try to dissect this with the understanding that the low figure is not necessarily universal, because Africa is not a country. And therefore, that understanding that is not a one statistical data point is important. So we take South Africa produces nearly 10 times more than the continent's average. And the 0.8 tons of carbon per person is comparable to the global average of 4.8. But when you take individual countries, you take South Africa, it produces 10 times. When you look at oil-producing countries like Libya and Equatorial Guinea, producing 95 times more than the continental average. So I decided to put this in perspective so that as we move forward, we can start to see how this is faring out. But when you take the most populous country like Nigeria, it emits per person 0.7 tons of carbon per person, which is below the continental average. So there are other countries, Ethiopia, the DRC, Tanzania, Mali, Niger, Mozambique, that are all emitting between 0.1 to 0.3 per person. But when you compare it with, for example, the world's largest economy like the United States, per person emission of carbon, tons of carbon is 16.2 tons. So that comparison is important because that then takes us now to the disaggregation of Africa's emissions. So where are these emissions coming from, even though they're negligible? Africa's emissions from commercial and industrial activity are actually least when you compare globally, but 75% comes from 5 fossil fuels, which 5 fossil fuel dependent countries, which is South Africa here, Nigeria, Algeria, Egypt, and Morocco. But when it comes to sectorial disaggregation, Africa's leading emission source is agriculture, contributing 56%, energy, 35%, and we have waste and industrial processes contributing both 4% and 4%. But going forward, where does Africa stand? The reality is that Africa stands to gain tremendously if it maintains its status as a low carbon emitter, but at the same time tap into opportunities that are actually within clean low emission development pathway. For example, it is estimated that the new business opportunities in sustainable food and land systems could actually be able to deliver up to 320 billion annually in the next 80 years across the entire sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, forest ecosystem services, restoration of degradation of land, and energy efficiency in entire supply chain improvements will result into billions of dollars. That said, and that given, where is then Africa when it comes to its climate priorities? The good news is that Africa's climate priorities, as expressed in their nationally determined contribution, actually reflect the urgent need to unlock socio-economic opportunities. Because the formulations of the NDCs of course, to move towards a low emissions development pathway, but at the same time, also to lift people from the bottom of the pyramid in terms of poverty, but in a way that lowers emissions. And when you look at the continent's low levels of socio-economic development, the priority then becomes making sure that at least what the NDCs capture is to unlock socio-economic opportunities to ensure responsiveness to leading priorities of country, but at the same time, compliance. So the NDCs of these countries across the entire continent, 52 countries submitted their first NDCs, only 2 countries did not, Libya and then Eritrea. Then the NDCs of these countries, though, as I said, lowering emissions and protecting ecosystem, are formulated first and foremost to drive socioeconomic opportunities. And therefore, those sectors that are actually like the anchor sectors in these countries constitute over 70% of the NDCs when you look through each and every one of them. And this is clean energy and sustainable agriculture. But there are other sectors that are captured not by every other country: forestry, waste, city, urban infrastructure, and transport amongst most of them. As we speak now, today, we have more remarkable level of commitment that have been shown, as I said earlier, 52 out of 54 countries, which constitute 98% of countries ratify the first NDCs, making Africa actually the leading region that have ratified with the submission of these NDCs. But then the updated NDCs, Africa is once again on the leadership board. 45 countries as we speak today have submitted their updated NDCs. And out of this submission of these updated NDCs, 21 of these countries in the continent have been lauded for submitting more ambitious emissions reduction targets in this second round. You have Namibia, a very ambitious target to cut emissions by 91% in the next 80 years. And out of these, this is conditional and 14% unconditional. We have Cote d'Ivoire, we have Ethiopia, we have Nigeria. But one thing I want us to understand and note here is that over 70% of the commitments are conditional. And therefore, the aspect of needing finance to be able to operationalize these NDCs to achieve the intended emissions reduction that the countries are put forward is something that we have to have in mind. So beyond NDCs, we have 15 African countries that have submitted the national adaptation plans to complement the NDCs. And these revolve around agriculture, resilient infrastructure, including cities, including forestry, water health, among key ones. But what I decided to do was that, okay, yes, we have this state of play with the submitted NDC. So what are we doing as UNEP, and what are the opportunities we can tap as we support countries? So the first aspect, building on what is already happening but not limited, is that if you look at these NDCs that these countries have submitted, 72% of them do not have investment plans. And that's an entry for UNEP. They do not have investment plans, and lacking investment plans, which are critical in supporting, in converting these plans and attracting investments and attracting resources, both from public and private sector, and of course, engaging the informal sector is very, very important. And I think from the work that UNEP is already doing through the NDC project, which is happening in Ghana, which is happening in Uganda and Morocco, being supported to translate their NDCs into implementation investment, is an excellent opportunity that we can capitalize on as an institution, because that is a big gap. This NDC project is founded on the principle of balancing mitigation adaptation, building on already ongoing actions in countries for confluence and aligning with priorities. If you take Ghana, for example, the intervention is enabling Ghana to bring together e-mobility as a mitigation priority, with solar power irrigation, which is a mitigation to action, but powering climate smart agriculture, but at the same time, helping with all these to formulate an investment plan that drives socioeconomic and climate potential for ensuring that the NDCs in these sectors are implemented. But one of the novel aspects that is happening in this work is that it complements ongoing efforts within the country. So it's not reinventing the wheel, but it's bringing new creativity and novelty to develop an e-mobility policy to capture critical enablers for greening the entire country's grid for e-mobility, as well as extend e-mobility infrastructure to off-grid areas like rural areas, as well as extend that infrastructure closer to markets. I think that is in Ghana. I just brought up this example with this project. And then there is Uganda that is looking completely from a very different perspective. So it's bringing up in Uganda, the project is helping the country to pick on different aspects, which is agroforestry, solar power irrigation, and solar dryers as a complementary to adaptation and mitigation areas. And so in formulating the investment plans that maximizes the socioeconomic potential, one of the novel aspects in what we're learning from Uganda is that the analysis that has been done shows that a composite investment combining agroforestry, solar power irrigation to build resilience at the farm level to maximize yields offers an opportunity for high returns on investment. So that is the first point, helping countries turn their NDCs into investment plan. And then that takes me to the second point, which is now pushing blended finance. All the NDCs of the continent for the countries that have submitted, 52 countries, then now the 45 that have updated, the financing gap is at least $3 trillion US dollars. This is from a study that was made by the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And this is nearly equivalent to the GDP of the entire continent, and therefore cannot be practically breached through public finance alone. And so through the NDC project, what is happening is the aspect of a finance facility, a low-risk finance facility that is being developed for Ghana and Uganda to unlock the power of market financing to drive this. I think this is a critical aspect that I think UNEP is actually bringing new knowledge into this. And for Ghana, this is being done frame around providing guarantees to corporate level financiers to enable them to provide debt capital for greening the grid for e-mobility. For Uganda, it's a little different because the formulation in Uganda is for financing non-capital intensive solutions. And Uganda is focusing on solar power irrigation, solar dryers, and this, as I said earlier. But there are some critical aspects that Uganda is considering, which is, if you look at the entire African continent, it's actually an informal sector-driven economy, because 80% of the jobs in the continent are produced from the informal sector. And actually, Africa is a pretty rural area continent. Why do I say so? Yes, there is rapid urbanization in the continent, but when the people come to the cities, where do they end up? In slums. And they then do not still benefit from what urbanization brings. Therefore, we cannot ignore also thinking of how do we also engage those. Yes, they live in urban cities, but they are not actually urbanized per se. And therefore, leveraging on structures that are closer to these people. In this case, Uganda will communal cooperatives to diversify beneficiary risk. This means that financing of actions is through pooling of resources to acquire assets, be it solar power irrigation, solar dryers, and these assets are being used communally. The second aspect that we're learning from there is to tap microfinance institutions, provide financing for intervention. And the other aspect is insurance. How do we optimize insurance so that at least it can be able to caution against volatility to ensure liquidity for beneficiaries in hands to meet their credit repayments? And that takes me now to the third point, which is a big opportunity for UNEP, I think, or UNEP is already a leader in this space, the strengthening of the national adaptation planning. Only 15 countries in Africa, I said earlier, have submitted the national adaptation plans to the UNFCCC, and this low compliance is for a region most vulnerable to the changing climate, and then needs clear-cut plans to accelerate adaptation readiness for impactful action. So UNEP is already leading this, implementing national adaptation plans readiness across many countries in the continent: Nigeria, Lesotho, Mauritania, Zimbabwe, Swatini, and others in the pipeline, Malawi, Ghana, and others. That should be continued and an opportunity. And then the fourth aspect is the biggest challenge sometimes, especially in this climate change space discourse, with so many actors within the UN and out of the UN, is the narrative creativity in terms of the narrative, which is, for example, how do we leverage mitigation to power adaptation, not necessarily driving it just from a narrative, but also showcasing it practically on the ground, and supporting this coherent integration of EBA, right, and clean energy solutions into leveraging the logic of mitigation powering adaptation is very, very important. And I think from the work that UNEP has actually been doing, we've been doing supporting countries to leverage climate action solutions of clean energy and to power actions that are produced using, especially agricultural sector, that are climate proof using EBA. It's very, very crucial. And the knowledge generated from these, which we are leveraging the Barbaza framework to share, that should continue. It's an opportunity, both from a normative and at the same time showcasing the practicality of expanding the continuum of adaptation, not just from a social perspective, but also from adding value that can be able to bring more actors on board. The fifth is back to what I said earlier, the informality of the continent's biggest population species or sports needs to be taken into consideration, especially from the perspective of the accountability structures that can be leveraged that are closer to the people. And one of these is the informal sector. We have to make sure that they're part and parcel of implementing the NDCs, because we need the data from there, and specifically leveraging traditional structures to be able to do this, whether it's communal cooperative, whether it is governance, local governance structures, which we've effectively done this using Buganda Kingdom in Uganda, And what we've seen is if you want impact to scale to be brought very quickly, you cannot ignore those structures that are closer to the people, so that at least they can actually be leveraged. We've showcased this, and the data that is coming out of this is quite very, very important. For example, if you take the Buganda Kingdom in Uganda, which has been leveraged to engage actors to be able to use EBA in cultivating cassava, to use solar dryers in drying cassava, and also engage one of the largest cooperatives in the area called CBS Pewosa. These have helped train and guided to shift investments away from unsustainable practices towards applying EBA, applying clean cooking solutions of waste recovery briquettes and solar dryers to increase shelf life. And then the last but not the least aspect is Africa is a young continent. Over 60% of the population is below the age of 25 years old, and the median age is 19 years. What does it mean? It means no matter how effective our science is, right? Yes, science is, and the policies are, the implementation action have to be driven by people. And you can only work with the formidable force you have. And these are young people. So retooling their skills and tapping into their ingenuity and creativity is very, very important. And this is really an arena in which capacity development, skills retooling, and at the same time, leveraging data to show the opportunities within the climate space is quite very, very instrumental. And what we have noticed is that this is an opportunity that we can use science policy linkage, tap into what is already ongoing in the continent, and use that data then to be able to inform more actions. Then the last part is data for policy. Policy is the biggest driver of change that we know, but policies sometimes need refinement from empirical evidence of proven successes that can actually provide an enabling implementation pathway. And what we've seen is data from solar drying have helped inform the National Bureau of Standards. For example, in Uganda, data coming from solar dryers have helped inform the development of standards and guidelines that are leveraged to then integrate climate action solutions of EBA, of clean cook stoves, of solar cool systems into standards, the same in Nigeria. And that is very, very crucial. It is then from this data that we think we can then make the case, not only to inform policies in government, but at the same time recalibrate implementation plans and vice versa. And that is what we've seen. So the key opportunities could be summarized in these 5 points. Narrative that diverts from projecting just liability, but to projecting investment opportunities, especially when the NDCs are turned into investment plans, is key. And making the case of breaking the silos, adaptation, very important for the continent, but is not sustainable if we do not bring in mitigation to power that and expand the entire value chain of any action. Then tapping to youth power and prioritizing institutions and tools we have, like working through the UN system, bringing our data, our science, and so that at least that can then cascade to other more UN agencies and bring impact to scale. And continue championing the thought leadership is the best way to go. Because we know that with a new UNEP delivery model, the benefit of this model that harnesses and harmonizes and strengthens UNEP to deliver as one indivisible unit for member states is an opportunity that can collectively bring a lot of transformational development, because we know that sticks in a bundle are unbreakable. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Brilliant. I think that gives a good insight on the situation and what is needed. And it strikes me that with the high emissions in the agriculture and nature side gives us a lot of opportunities for also then building the resilience and kind of delivering almost 2 in 1. So both adaptation and mitigation outcomes. Colleagues, the floor is open, and so is the chat box. So Richard, if you stop sharing, like it's disturbing for me to see myself. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, the floor is open. Colleagues, please raise your hands and I'll give you the floor. And if you don't have questions, I will have questions, and that means that you're going to hear more of me. That can't be what you want. So who's the first that takes on the floor? Yes, Babu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Richard, for making an excellent presentation with a lot of data and information. This is very comprehensive. Now, I'm just trying to put a couple of the statistics of the number that you have mentioned and trying to put them in a perspective. Now, what you have mentioned in terms of the emission from the continent as a whole is about 3 to 4% in terms of the global share. Population-wise, it is about 17%. Also, you have mentioned that in the NDC, 70% is the conditional. Now, when I was trying to put these three together, and when you mentioned using the NDC as an opportunity to unlock the socio-economic development for the region and obviously for the countries. Now, as a part of unlocking that potential, you talked about the financing plan, investment plan, etc. Now, when I was trying to put those together, I was thinking, what is your views on, instead of developing the separate financing strategy for NDCs as they are the conditional, whether it would be better for African countries to think about making it as a part of the development plan. Because if the 70% of the NDCs are conditional, then basically they will be relying on the resources, the technology to come from outside. And that is not going to come easily. Either it will come through the market mechanism or the grant. Now, in terms of really unlocking the potential for the countries in the region, whether the climate change is better to handle through the development planning and making the development plan more resilient and more cleaner. So what would be your views on that? So that's my query.
Richard,
you'll be a very good politician, Babu.
do you dare to take another question, or was that so long that you want to go for that first?
I think I can handle it. And the beauty is that it is a view, right? And then I can give a comment. So thank you very much, Babu. You're very correct. So from what you're saying is you cannot mortgage your development because at the end of the day, you are saying you will do this. You need socioeconomic opportunities to lift people from the bottom of the pyramid. Then you don't have the money. So that is answer in what I think UNEP is helping countries to do now, because the blended financing, what is happening is that the implementation of those action plans are actually opportunities for socio-economic development. And therefore, the blended finance facility is not only for financial support that comes from external sources, but is also looking at internal sources. But internal sources that are aligned to implementing the climate ambition of the country. Let me just give the practical example that I gave. So the case of Ghana, they are focusing on how do you make sure that at least you develop a financing plan that engages a microfinance organization and at the same time uses government to develop a de-risking facility so that credit can be assessed. So when you look at it, you will notice that even individuals can be able to access that funding to maybe assess a solar power irrigation tool to then irrigate their farm and add value using a solar dryer, reduce post harvest losses using a solar cooling system, but make money, put money in their pocket, but they're advancing a climate ambition, but at the same time, their interest is actually their socio-economic. So what you said is very true. So it's how we tilt the climate development towards the real development of the country, so that investments in that are seen as development investments. And that is about narrative. And so that narrative becomes now really a very important point for UNEP now to shift it. And that is what I think, if we leverage on this NDC investment approach we are using now, we can move forward. But those are very valid points. And that is actually an aspect that is holding this logic to take center stage moving forward.
Excellent. Colleagues, by the way, feel free to put on your cameras if your bandwidth allows, so that we can feel more togetherness. And then I got David and Alvin. So David, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Not a question, but a comment. The IMF is more regularly referring to the fiscal, broader economic and poverty impacts of climate change in Africa. However, at the country level, the IMF offices, I've worked with one in Malawi and another in Mozambique, are not reflecting the fiscal risks in their Article 4 consultations and in their discussions with government over climate change resilience building. For example, in Mozambique, one report has calculated that the country faces annual losses of $440 million a year due to floods alone. So I'd like to suggest that a strategic initiative by UNEP at the highest level, and definitely at the Africa regional level, should be a formal evidence-based engagement with the IMF to encourage them to to walk the talk at country level based on their statements at regional level of the fiscal, economic and poverty dangers of climate change in Africa. Thank you. Hey, great presentation, Richard. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Richard, do you want to react or?
Yeah, you know, the beauty of comments and views is that you must not react. But I think for this one, I'll react. Thank you very much, David. I think what you are saying is very true, because the reality is that there is what is currently going on now. I think, Nick, you know this very well, debt swaps for adaptation. And one of the conditions is also going to be, do you have those risk indicators in place that can actually be leveraged to showcase that your risk profile in terms of disasters and in terms of how you will utilize the money to prevent those and build resilience can happen. And countries that are definitely going to tap into this needs to have that. And I think that having that risk profile, not only the risk profile, but also having the mitigation techniques in terms of place, in place to be able to reduce a potential risk, whether it is drought or floods, and the resilience building that aligns to the country's development plans will be quite very important. But your point was that UNEP should develop a program, and you are speaking to the right people, and Nick is sitting here. So Nick, over to you.
Yeah, like, okay, let's take out the money and let's invest in it. Thanks, and nice try, Richard. Yeah, no, but indeed, let's discuss further. Alvin and then Alamgir.
Thanks, Richard, for the great presentation, and always, wonderful to hear you. One great conversation that was happening at the Africa Finance Ministers meeting early last month was the financing needs for Africa. And I was just wondering whether you'd be able to comment, how has the financing needs, particularly in the climate change space, changed since COVID? Has it, become much more urgent and much more compared to before? It was interesting seeing Africa as a region came up with a huge investment plan ahead of COP in terms of needs, and much of it was in the agriculture or in the energy sector. And then some of the cases that you talked about resonates to that. My second question is really around, the adaptation needs for Africa are quite broad. There is definitely that need for accelerated program to divert finance, but we shouldn't really turn an eye away from the actual loss and damage that's currently happening. And to that end, the finance ministers were talking about a very robust proposable framework on loss and damage. You're thinking around blended finance in terms of thinking about financial instruments that could avert, minimize, and address loss and damage beyond compensation. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that one. So over to you.
Interesting questions, two of them, very interesting. Thanks a lot, Alvin. I appreciate your feedback, and thanks for the good work you are doing with the adaptation unit. The first one, of course, COVID, the report from the United Nations Economic Commission shows over 70% of countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are economically distressed. That means the physical space have actually reduced since COVID happened. And in terms of what the continent was doing, still in a report that was produced in 2019, showed that Africa was contributing over 2 billion to adaptation using their national budget. So I'm sure if that report was done again today, that amount must have reduced. But the point I want to bring to your real question, which is Africa's financing needs. So if you look at it, what I said, if you look at the NDCs, the total amount to implement those NDCs is above $3 trillion US. So when you juxtapose that within the financial space of climate finance, that's impossible. So so when you put reality versus optimistic, ambitious discussions, the reality doesn't match up, because 100 billion promised since 2009 have not materialized. 3 trillion will not materialize, right? So that takes us back to that point that I think Babu asked, which is, why don't you work with what you have? Because every single passing day, that text goes not to your loss and damage. People are losing property, they are losing livestock, and they're losing lives. So how do we then build on what is there as we look for more, knowing that we can then be able to continuously try to raise the financing needs to address and build capacity? So I would say my thought, since you asked for my thought, is the continent needs to leverage the limited resources they have in each country, because then they will have leverage, not only leverage from international finance, but also leverage from the private sector, from looking into maybe on-tap financing like hedge funds and also alternative financing, like actually the private sector, but maybe private sector that is using structures that are closer to people. For example, let me say, in Cameroon, where I come from, there are local communal institutions, cooperatives called Tontings, Njangis. They actually contribute 50% to the GDP of the country, but nobody ever taps these resources. So how about that system of blended finance is capturing this, so that at least people can have access to credit to carry out actions that actually buffer them both socioeconomically and at the same time also drive the development agenda, more so the climate commitment of the country. And that now ends up in the point of narrative that I mentioned. It is UNEP actually the center of environmental thought leadership to start pushing these kind of strong narratives so that these countries can see. Because I can tell you lastly, most of the countries do not believe that they can be able to leverage internal funds. They will not be enough to kickstart, but wait till they come. But the point is, with loss and damage, which you've mentioned, people are dying every day. People are losing, droughts are happening here. People are losing their livestock. And they say, if you tell a hungry child that you gave him or her food yesterday, that means nothing to that child now because that child is hungry. So it's the same thing, that at least using internal resources to build resilience and, of course, adverse the damages and losses, but at the same time, bringing it to the international stage to say, this is what we've done, this is how we are doing it. And I think our support in these narratives, support in capacity development, support in intelligence sharing and knowledge sharing can actually start to close the gaps in these spaces. It was a long-winded one, but at least.
Thanks, Richard and Alvin. Alamgir?
Thanks, Nicholas. First of all, thank you, Richard, for very interesting presentation. For someone like me who has never had an opportunity to work in Africa, this was something really kind of an eye-opener, and I've learned a lot.
Thank you.
My comment or question is basically related to in line with what Babu was saying. I was amazed to see that, in terms of NDC submission, Africa pretty much is the most compliant. Only 2 countries.
Alamgir, I think you ended up muting yourself, or then somebody muted you. Now you're muted again.
I'm unmuted again.
You're back. Thank you.
Okay, I didn't. Anyways, said so. As I was saying, having most of the LDCs and only 50 NAPs being submitted, and the kind of statistics that you have shown, like 70% is conditional, 30% is unconditional. Can we and the kind of opportunities that we're seeking, my comment can be naive in terms of with very limited knowledge of Africa, whether that can we come up with, or whether there has been analysis of those 30% unconditional commitments and how that relates with the adaptation priorities, if there is a analysis of those cases. And whether, those adaptation mitigation joint benefits, because a lot of the examples that you gave, apart from the e-mobility case and the sectors that you have mentioned, is basically low-tech technologies relying on, on-farm and off-farm technologies for agriculture or water or energy sector. And if that can be really done, then potentially this can really create the opportunity for longer-term investment plan. As you were discussing around, coming, those plans will take time. And currently the climate finance that is available globally is not necessarily adequate enough, whatever we are commenting in the NAP in terms of each countries, as well as the NDCs for those 70% conditional ones. So whether there is any thinking around in Africa to come up, at least for those 30% unconditional one, to tap it up with the national adaptation priorities, and how those two actually came together in the prioritization of this country's process. And if we can have a synthesis around that, a strong business can, in my point of view, can possibly be formed for longer term investment. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks a lot. Alagi, very important and it's a timely question that is very key. So the development of the investment plans, especially with the case of Ghana and Uganda. So the thinking is this, because one of the logic of the projects was, how do you marry mitigation with adaptations, right? And most of the countries' NDCs are not set out to be implemented in synergy with mitigation. And when you look at what you are saying, the unconditional commitment of countries is 30%, where 70% is unconditional. So the argument with the blended finance facility is that the little resources, for example, if it is 30% unconditional, can this be leveraged as a de-risking amount of money, so that at least it can help attract investors, so the central banks can leverage that, for example, and set up de-risking facilities that can then help to de-risk microfinancing organizations and big banks, so that when investors or when they give loans or credit out for actions to be carried out in some of these sectors, at least the default will now be covered. That's one aspect. The other aspect is to put in place enabling policies that can actually attract investments, leveraging those little resources, that 30%, to then create the enabling environment, both from a policy perspective and physical incentives, like tax breaks, which some countries are already doing. Kenya in the 2021, like I said, a finance bill did give tax breaks for clean cook stoves, biogas, and others. But can this be scaled up so that 30% is more catalytic, but creating an enabling environment? But from what you've said, brilliant. And I think that will inform new thinking going forward, doing an analysis to look at what can this 30% do and feed that into structures and facilities that can then help assist countries like the blended finance facility we're doing. So thank you very much, Alamgi, for that.
Thanks, Richard. Alice, and then Sudhir.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, and thank you, Richard. You know, I had to ask a question because it's you presenting. Thank you so much for the nice presentation. But my question is a bit subjective, if you allow me.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, yes, Richard. I've been in UNEP for the last 6 years now. I've read, and I'm not a technical person, I'm not a scientist. I've read so much documents and what UNEP has gathered over the years to really try to mitigate and maybe mitigate adaptation of climate change. They have done a lot. I've seen a lot of presentation with the good ideas on what needs to be done in Africa, especially. And my question will be, all these years, I've not seen a success story being said that this is the idea which UNEP brought, and this is the strategy that we are taking to ensure that we are going to do this, because at the end of the day, as you say, the youth who are like 70% in Africa, that is between 15 and 30, are the ones to maybe to take up these where there's a challenge, there's an opportunity. You are trying to explore and say the youth are coming up, they are very innovative. So once we give them a platform, they are going to have this platform and come up with the opportunities, of course, to improve their economic status. But then my question is, what is stopping UNEP from sharing these success stories or from doing these nice things or nice ideas that they keep on telling us about many things that you are doing in African region? Thank you.
Richard, I think you have been put on the spot. Good luck.
I thought it was a question to UNEP, not to me, right? So you should start first.
But you're going to have to answer it.
You know, that's the jokes aside. Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. I think you are spot on. Just to start by saying that the truth is that success stories from the region have been showcased, but are they showcased enough? No. Do we have still a lot of work to do there in terms of doing so? Yes. And I think now that takes me to a very crucial point that I would then make from your question, which is that I think it is the responsibility of each and every program officer to be able to also showcase their work, right? But now there is also the internal UNEP annual report, which currently there have been circulation to provide excellent success stories of UNEP work in the region. I think that's also an opportunity to showcase this. But what I think internally, and especially from the office, what could happen is that instead of only waiting for annual report, we could also have UNEP in Africa success stories report that showcases some of these examples. But it should not just be for internal usage, but it should also be most so in the form of policy briefs that can actually get at there. Is this happening? Yes, but not at the speed in which it's supposed to happen. So I would say thank you for that wake-up call. And I think that it will now maybe help as an impetus for much of that to be done. But I hope you are on Twitter, so you can also tweet when we share.
Thank you. Richard, there's a question in the chat box. So just perhaps after, we only have 8 minutes left. So if you could answer that then in the chat after the session, but Sudhir and then Muhammad. And try to be as succinct as possible.
Very brief. Thanks, Richard. Nice to see you. Lovely shirt.
Thank you.
I'm trying to figure out which is better, the shirt or the presentation. Presentation was really nice. It gave a very good comprehensive picture. I'm not an adaptation person, but just 2 quick questions. One, I heard of an African adaptation initiative where I think African Development Bank is going to put 12.5 billion. They're leveraging some funds, and it seems like an interesting kind of a model. So is UNEP looking into that model and using that as a basis for seeing what could be done to scale up what you said the challenge was, the scale of challenge is big. Second, being a carbon markets person, I see that 70% of the NDCs are conditional. So are the governments looking at using this early phase till 2030, 40 as a basis of actually leveraging carbon market, because there will be a lot of countries which might be looking for credits to meet their own targets. And that could be an area which possibly helps combine the adaptation mitigation ourselves, because agriculture, forestry seems to be a big area where emissions could be reduced in Africa. Thank you. Back to you.
Richard, before you answer, I think that was a straightforward question. So let's take Muhammad's as well. And I saw you took notes. So Muhammad.
Good morning, Richard. How are you? Greetings from Abidjan.
Welcome,
I'm trying to help with my brother to answer Ali's question. And I think this is a question that we are facing today in the UN cities, UN country teams. And people are asking, where is UNEP? What have you done? And the answer is just very simple. Last time I was in Benin and the UNRC asked me, I don't see UNEP. I say, look, if you are talking about plastic, give me one program today is not including environment. The government is asking you to include the environment, to include plastic, to include pollution, to include mitigation, to include biodiversity. That's a huge success. Remember what Akim used to say when we went to him and said, look, a green economy is our baby. We have to protect it. He said, no, let others do it. And I think that our work today is being amplified through our partners, being in biodiversity, being in pollution, being in climate change, adaptation, and all that. I think we need to learn how to position our organization through what is being done by other entities, by our partners, by the UN system. Environment today, including adaptation and mitigation, is at the heart of the CF, the Country Cooperation Framework. And we need to know how to position UNEP in a strategic way. And let me give you an example about adaptation and also mitigation, concrete examples. There was a time we went to North Africa, to Morocco, and we were walking in that biggest actually solar farm that was actually developed by the country. And the head of the director of that compound asked me, what can we do with UNEP? And said, we have done a lot. Look at this compound. I think without influencing at very high level your country, I think we could not achieve this. The same on biodiversity. We used to sell, those fruits that we used to give to donkeys, and sell for $1. Today, people are extracting oil from that and selling it, at 89 euro as a solution, and communities are sending their children to school. So it is working. There are hundreds of successful stories on adaptation and mitigation. One last thing that we should pay attention to, and sorry, Nicholas, I'm coming back, I'm ending my intervention. It's sometimes we provide a solution and we create another problem. I give you a concrete example. Yes, no, sorry, the farmers in one of the countries, I'm not going to name it, in Africa, used to, to pump water, they use gas, natural, and gas is becoming expensive. We are promoting solar. Shift from gas to solar energy. So now that solar and the energy is free, people are pumping water like there is no tomorrow for irrigation. So they created another problem. And this is the kind of, if you want, intelligence and information that we need to collect from the ground to make sure that we don't solve a problem and create another, because water stress is a huge issue in this continent, and we may face this issue in going forward. So we need to work very closely with countries so we guide them on avoiding, finding solutions, smart solutions, but also avoiding creating other problems. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. Richard, before you go to Sudhir's question and answer it, I would like to get Thaddeus in 1 minute and then 1 minute response from Richard. Edie?
All right. Thank you so much, Richard, and thanks, Nicholas. Well, let me go straight to my concern. Well, Richard, you'll have to forgive me if I missed this part of presentation as I joined in late, but my question will be on priorities. I saw energy and agriculture. Now, to put this in perspective, although Africa contributes dismally to emissions, there is a worrying trend that rapid urbanization and increasing levels of car ownership is putting the continent at the risk of becoming one of the largest emitters and may derail efforts to cap emissions. My question is transport a priority for the region? And if that is the case, how is ambition reflected across member countries? I may have missed this in your presentation, but you can correct me. Thank you.
Thanks, Edie. Richard.
It looks like a planted question to Thaddeus. So can I start from yours, then I come to CD, and then Mohammed was more a comment, right? Yes, so that Nicola has given me. Yes, I think you joined late. Transport is captured in some of the countries, but not all. So if you look at 70% of the NDCs in Africa capture energy, and under energy, you have transport also. E-mobility is one of them. And I explained how in Ghana, we are working with the Ghanaian government to leverage on e-mobility as a mitigation aspect, and also solar power irrigation, which is actually leveraging climate smart agriculture, but to develop a financing facility so that at least it can actually attract investments. And therefore, one of the aspects that you came in and we were discussing is that, yes, even if transport is captured in NDCs of countries, they are still conditional. They still need resources to operationalize the implementation of that. So they can have it as aspirational and to show that they have it, but until the rubber hits the road, nothing will change. So one of the aspects also is, if it works somewhere, can the success story be used to incentivize and inspire other countries to tap into e-mobility and transport pathways that are actually helpful? I think that's what I would say before Nicholas stops me. Then I go to Sudhi. Thank you very much for that. Yes, the UNEP is part of what is called the NDC's hub, where we have UNEP, we have the African Union, we have the ADB. And that NDC hub is actually where experiences and lessons sharing happens, and what is happening within the Adaptation Accelerated Program is also shared. Firstly, one thing I just want to quickly say is that the space for climate action in Africa is crowded. Yeah, but that's okay. But what is more important is how do we bring the bits and pieces together so that at least we can have a bigger cake, and in that way incentivize actors to pick it up. And so there is knowledge exchange and lessons coming from UNEP side. Your aspect of carbon credits, yes, actually I was surprised that question didn't come out from you. I know it's a hot topic at the moment. Yes, actually during COP there is the Africa Carbon Market Initiative that is being led by it's actually been driven by UNICA, the UN Economic Commission for Africa. But the point is that this is also being shared in what is called OIBCs. which is a regional collaborative platform that I think is in all the regions that brings UN agencies together. So there's UNICA, there is UNEP, there is UNDP, there is FAO. But this is the point. The point is that Africa is a supply from the supply side, is not from the demand side. And what is taking place in Africa is mostly voluntary carbon markets, which means that if you compare it to the mandatory carbon market versus the voluntary carbon markets, the establishment of the systems within the continent have not been as compared to the mandatory carbon market. So what is needed at the moment is to build that capacity, and also for governments to actually create the enabling environment for private sector to pick that up. To just answer your question, yes, the continent is looking into that, but you know how these processes work. And given the fact that the continent have not fully established as compared to other regions that were part of the CDM, they can build on the lessons of the CDM, though it was only 2% of those projects that did come to the continent for the CDM, but they can build on those lessons to establish a very robust system. But will that be able to fund the gap of 3 trillion? The jury is out.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard, also for a great presentation, and colleagues for a very lively discussions. As often before, it would be good to have more time, but we are trying to squeeze this all in 1 hour. So thanks all. Richard, I would like you still to think of 3 things that you would need from this team that has been in the meeting, and then write into the chat box. It sounded like finance would be, like the solutions for finance would be one thing. And then Jade, what's next on the agenda? Where will we find all of this? And then actually you can close for us as well. Jade?
Thanks, Nicholas. Yeah, I just wanted to say a big thank you to you, Richard, for this really clear and great presentation. And thank you to all the colleagues who were able to join us today. So I'll share the presentation in the chat box right now, and then the links to the recordings and presentation will be available on We Collaborate. The recordings are in the presentation of the meeting on Asia Pacific is also available on We Collaborate. We don't have a date yet for the next regional priorities brand bag, but I'll keep you updated whenever we have the presenter and the date. But we do have the next climate change brown bag. It'll be next week on electric mobility, with Rob. So if you haven't received that invitation, please reach out to me and I'll be able to forward it to you. And we will have one on loss and damage the following week on October 20th. And then you'll receive like the updates every couple weeks because we have a lot of them planned. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, colleagues.
Excellent.
That's it.
Thanks, colleagues.
Don't forget
I hope
keep it
we will increase the time. Next time, Nick, to 2 hours of brand bag, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Colleagues,
right.
don't forget the KPPO awards in 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Excellent.
Thanks a lot. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Richard.